Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar of March 2020. My name is Jean Boudot. I'm joined today by James Morrison, our expert in biocompatibility. We've got a couple of dates and trends to present for 2020, and we'll be talking about chemistry takes over from biology and cell cultures, replacing laboratory animals. For those who don't know us, we are a consultancy company headquartered in Sydney, Australia. We've been serving industry for over 20 years, so we've got clients of all sizes, starting from startup companies and up to multinationals. We've got offices around the globe, presence in Los Angeles, Wellington, Beijing, Taipei, and Hong Kong. And since 2019, we've been merging with our long-term partners in the pharmaceutical space to now support not only medical devices and IVDs, but also the drug industry. So as I mentioned today, I'm joined by James Morrison. As you can see on the screen, James is involved in a lot of international working groups on the topic of biocompatibility. He's also one of our senior consultants involved in biocompatibility, product development, manufacturing, validation, and regulatory strategies. And so James will be providing us an update on the 2020 developments for the standards and biocompatibility. I'm Jean Boudot. I've joined in 2017. My areas of expertise are on design and development, design controls, regulatory strategies, particularly for the US, Europe, Canada, and Australia, as well as quality management system. In terms of our agenda for today, so we will first talk about the changes in the standards for 2020 and the work in progress. James will then be presenting some of the challenges which obviously come together with those changes. We'll summarize on some of the takeaways, and we'll have an opportunity basically to interact and have a couple of questions around some of those aspects of biocompatibility for next year.
Well, thank you, John, for your introduction, and hello everybody and welcome to our webinar. I trust that you find this instructive, and of course if there are questions that you have after the webinar on these subjects, then my email address is embedded in the presentation, and I would welcome your questions directed to me. So the first thing that we're going to talk about are the changes for 2020 in terms of biocompatibility standards. So on the screen there are listed 4 standards that have recently been amended or up-revved. And these are Part 7 for ethylene oxide residue, Part 9 for a framework for degradation products, Part 15 for metal degradation products, and Part 18 for chemical characterization. Some of these came out last year and Part 18 came out this year. Let me talk you through those changes in particular. So Part 7 was amended. So the amendment is specifically to allow application of this standard to the allowable limits for neonates and infants. This is essentially a how-to when it comes to derating the allowable limits of ethylene oxide on a device after sterilization for a low body weight application. Clearly, when you have a low body weight, then the amount of ethylene oxide that can be tolerated goes with that body weight, and so it has to be derated. And the standard is quite instructive in its amendment to show how that should be done. There are some changes to the standards for degradation products, and so Part 9 is a high-level framework document, and it has been revised, and the specific revision really is that we're now talking about degradation studies for devices that are designed to be absorbed in the body or very long-term implants, and really an informed consideration about materials where there might be toxic degradation products from the device. So this is a framework to guide the thinking of everybody who is dealing with devices that are degradable, whether that's absorbable or long-term degradation in situ in the body. Coincidental with the release of the Part 9 revision is the revision of Part 15, and Part 15 is all about the application of the principles in Part 9 as it relates to metal and alloy devices. And really the key improvements to Part 15 are around better specifications for the test methods in producing and identifying degradation products. A big change in the 10993 series of standards has been the revision of Part 18, which is chemical characterization of medical device materials. This is a very large revision. The new edition is 70 pages, which probably most of you will find intimidating. But the good news is that those 70 pages include a lot of guidance. It's more about guidance than anything else. And it's not just guidance of the process of meeting the standard, it's also guidance about the right way to think about the problems that are encountered. One of the key pieces of guidance that comes out is that everybody in the application of this standard should use as much existing information as is possible. That is, you shouldn't be doing more testing or more investigation if you have existing information that you can use. So no new testing and no repeat testing might be a good way to think about this. A companion piece of guidance with that previous one is that you should only do the characterization that makes sense. That is, do the characterization that is fit for the device in terms of its body contact characterization and the way it works and what it's made from. So the characterization should be sensible. There are, in this revision, some very good flowcharts to guide processes and activities in characterizing the device. And these flowcharts can be entered and indeed exited anywhere. So you don't have to start and work your way through masses of processes on the flowchart and then finally come out at the very end of the chart. You can enter and exit as is most appropriate, and this very much goes with the previous 2 points on the slide, to only use existing data if it's possible and to only do the characterization that is sensible. And the flowcharts and this permission to enter and exit where necessary is entirely consistent. And this is all very important because the requirement for physical and chemical information is now in the first column on table A1 in part 1 of the standard. So there is a universal requirement here for physical and chemical information for all biocompatibility evaluations, and Part 18 is about providing that information in that context. And there is a companion document to the recently revised Part 18, which is the new edition of Part 17, which is toxicological risk assessment of medical device constituents. So this is currently a work in progress, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about what's coming next. So as we've spoken about what has changed, I think that it would be equally wise for me to tell you about the possible changes that are coming in the future. And so some of these we have a fairly good idea about timeframes, others are less certain. But the first two I want to talk to you about is a new standard, which is 10993 Part 23, and that is tests for irritation. That will probably be published in the next couple of months. And 10993 Part 10, a revision thereof, and that's tests for skin sensitization. That will probably come out at about the same time or soon after Part 23. Originally, Part 10 was a standard for tests for skin sensitization and irritation. And the two subjects have been divided, which is why we have a new standard, which is tests for irritation. And the tests for skin sensitization are what's left of the old Part 10, so there's the reason for the new revision there. The tests for skin irritation are changed in the one particular case that there is now an in vitro test method for irritation, and that is such a departure from the previous in vivo test methods that it was thought wise to make irritation a new standard now, because we are opening it up with the availability of an in vitro method. Another new standard that is soon to be released, published, is 14155, which is clinical investigations of medical devices for human subjects, the good clinical practice standard. It's often a point that is glossed over in considering biocompatibility for medical devices, that the clinical investigations have to be very well done. This is part of the responsibility of the ISO Technical Committee 194, alongside their responsibility for the biocompatibility test standards in 10993. So 14155 for good clinical practice is hopefully to be published in the next 6 months. There is also a revision of Part 12, which is sample preparation and reference materials for biological evaluation. Part 12 is a part that is applied very widely in conjunction with all the other standards about biocompatibility, and the revision has been in progress now for some time, and that hopefully will be published in the coming 6 months. Let me talk about some of the challenges that people in the biocompatibility space will face this year. One of the difficulties that standards have is how they are accepted in the international community. And nowhere is that more evident than in the matter of European harmonisation. So the harmonised version of 10993 Part 1 is currently the 2009 version, whereas the most recently released version of Part 1 is of course 2018. So harmonisation into a European harmonised standard is really a legal matter, and the mechanism by which the harmonisation is achieved is currently running a little bit behind their program, and that means that they haven't yet harmonised the 2018 version of Part 1. So on one hand, the legally binding standard for European applications would be the 2009 harmonised version. And those who are assessing conformity would be looking to see that they are assessing conformity to the harmonised standard. But they're also supposed to be using the state of the art, which is represented by the 2018 version of the standard. So this leads to a conflict between the two standards, and it is perhaps uncertain which standard will be applied as conformity is assessed. So this will be a challenge. It will be a challenge not only for manufacturers, but also for notified bodies and other agencies as they come to terms with the degree of harmonisation and the state-of-the-art standard. Another area where there will be challenges in the coming year is the whole question of industry maturity for chemical characterisation. The standard will instruct all sorts of parties in the medical device industry about chemical characterisation, and once it teaches about those subjects, then it will be up to the participants in the industry to be able to put that new knowledge into practice and make good use of it. So there will be a learning curve for manufacturers and laboratories who are servicing the industry, the contract research organisations, toxicologists who will use the information, regulators and notified bodies who will review the output of the work that's done in this area. Everybody will be on that learning curve. Clearly, there are some participants who are going to be more mature in their understanding and their ability to make good use of it than others, but it is an issue and it will be a challenge for the coming year. And it goes almost without saying that the whole matter of scientific or technological advancement and development will be a challenge as well. And we're not only facing this as it relates to chemical characterization, we're also facing this as it relates to new types of devices and new types of device materials to facilitate those devices, more complex interactions between materials and other things. So for example, in the case of combination products or products that are used to deliver pharmaceuticals. So the ongoing struggle with scientific advancement and technological development will continue, and it will continue to challenge players in the industry, and everybody should be well advised that biocompatibility is almost always a work in progress, and that you have to think very carefully about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And equally, not only do you have to think about it, but you have to be prepared to explain your thinking so that other people who are looking at the results of your work can understand what it is you've done and why it is you've done it that way. So the three takeaways that I have for you from this little presentation are European harmonization. Make sure that you have a robust scientific rationale for why you have applied one standard, either the harmonized EN ISO 10993 Part 1 or the state-of-the-art standard, the 2018 version. Make sure that your rationale is robust and clearly explained in your documentation. In terms of industry maturity, work hard at putting the new standards into practice. That's really the best advice that anyone can give you on this subject, because it does require hard work. It requires careful thinking, and it requires diligent application to get the best use out of the standards. It's no longer a case of throwing it over the wall and saying to a service provider, can you please give us a Part 18 on this, as might have been done in the past. Now, everybody has to think carefully about what characterization is required and how best it can be achieved, and that's only going to be achieved by careful consideration. And in the area of scientific advancement and technological development, I encourage everybody to read widely on what's going on in the field, to try things, to actually experiment, compare test methods, compare processes, consider what the outcome is of different approaches. Perhaps do some research. Perhaps do two test methods in parallel in order to establish which one gives an appropriate results framework for your device. Collaborate. That is, don't do things in isolation. Work with your service providers. Work with your suppliers. Ask them questions. Publish. When you've done some work and when you've had some success, and equally even when you've had failure, publish it. Make it available for everybody in the industry to see. There are plenty of places where stuff can be published. It can be published in peer-reviewed journals, of course, if you wish, but there are also many trade publications that are always looking for sensible content. And everyone in the industry will thank you for sharing what you have learnt, because that will improve everybody's quality of understanding. And of course, participate in the discussions that are taking place in industry. Participate with industry bodies, participate with professional societies. Do not operate in glorious isolation, if I can call it that, but actually participate with your peers in the industry.
So thanks, James, for the perspective on the update for 2020. I've got a couple questions and a couple points that you've raised, and I'd like to maybe go back on a few items here. The first thing that you mentioned, which really echoed to me, was that in the past there would have been probably some acceptance with a bit of a checklist attitude, both by the industry but the regulator as well. Do you think it's really essentially becoming a bit harder for manufacturers, or do you think that actually provides a bit more flexibility in the approach now?
Thanks, Jean. It's certainly true that in the past there was a checklist mentality, and I think that over the last 5 or so years a lot of that checklist thinking has been overcome. But I do think that it's a little bit harder now than it used to be in conducting biocompatibility evaluations. But although it has become harder and perhaps longer and perhaps even more expensive in some ways, it has become much better in terms of the quality and the specific nature of the results. And certainly it has become better in terms of the animal welfare perspective, because we have less dependence on in vivo testing. And overall, I think this has led to an improvement in device safety, and certainly in terms of improvements in manufacturing controls.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you think is going to be the approach, say, from a manufacturer? What recommendation would you make for them to deal with that change?
So I think that certainly manufacturers should be collaborating more with their service providers and their suppliers. So they should be asking more pointed questions of those who supply them with perhaps materials, and they should be asking and telling more to their testing providers and to their laboratory service people. And very often these will be conversations that involve multiple parties, so that'll involve, for example, in the subject of chemical characterization, before you begin the characterization process, you should really have a negotiation which involves your toxicologists, your manufacturing engineers, your product development people, your material scientists, your analytical chemistry laboratory. So there will be a number of people who need to come and sit at the table and understand the problem before characterization can begin.
So there's a lot more planning basically in that phase, yeah.
Yes.
So specifically on the topic of chemical characterization, what would you say is the most critical aspect of that process that a manufacturer would need to address, for example, in their technical dossier for the device?
So I think before we even get to the technical dossier, I think that in the process of establishing the chemical characterization, I think the most important thing is to only do as much characterization as the device requires. That is, not to do an excessive amount of work, but to do what is sensible.
Okay.
And of course, when it comes to the dossier, what will be most important there is that the scientific rationale for the degree of characterization must be clearly documented. You've made some good decisions before you did it. Make sure that those good decisions are clearly communicated and well documented in your technical files.
Yeah, so it's really just about explaining your thinking, justifying your methods, rather than applying a simple checklist.
Correct, yeah. Absolutely.
So we're looking at future standard development in the part 15. Obviously, you know, the focus at the moment is on the resorbable metals. Is there anything happening for other types of products such as plastic, ceramics, etc., or is there any perspective on this in the near future?
Certainly there is work in progress to revise the standards for absorbable polymers and absorbable ceramics. That work is currently in progress. I suspect that the work will be completed soon for the ceramics and much later for the plastics. The plastics is a much broader field. It's much more complicated than just polylactic acid, and so I suspect that it will be a longer time frame for the standard for degradable polymers.
Okay. And the last point, you know, we were discussing about harmonization and some of the challenges with the transition to the medical device regulations in Europe. So obviously that problem of harmonization is not specific to biocompatibility. That's something which is just a pattern of the implementation. When it comes to, I suppose, acceptance of the standards in other jurisdictions in terms of those new developments, what's the current state of acceptance, recognition, say, for example, in the US or Australia, other jurisdiction? Can you provide a perspective on this?
Well, certainly I can, thank you. The various jurisdictions, generally speaking, publish their acceptance or otherwise of the international standards. So I think many of our listeners today would be well aware of the FDA's consensus standards database, where they actually say which standards they accept and which parts of the standards they accept where it's only a partial acceptance. Mm-hmm. So that is reasonably well published by authorities having jurisdiction in many different places. And there are some places where it is a little bit more obscure, and of course you will have to work with the authorities in the particular jurisdiction that you're concerned with if there's anything in particular. But I do think that there is a tendency for standards to be well accepted by medical device regulating agencies, because those agencies are in fact involved in the ISO standardization process. So when a new standard is released, the FDA aren't going to be surprised by its release, because they've probably had someone working on the revision and they've had an opportunity to have their views heard and understood in the process, and they know that it's coming. So they have a good mechanism for participation, and generally speaking, they can comfortably recognise the standard. But of course, this varies right across the jurisdictions, and it's such a specific question that every jurisdiction has to answer it for themselves.
Yeah. And I think, you know, there's this contribution and you know, with the regulator, but also as part of your product application, you would still need, in any case, you'd need to demonstrate that the methods that you've actually selected are appropriate for your device and for your use case. So, you know, it's not probably just a problem of harmonization, but simply selecting the right method and justifying your thinking anyway. So
absolutely. I cannot stress enough to our listeners and viewers today the importance of good scientific rationale in a technical dossier.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, James, for that. Really appreciate the perspective on that update on biocompatibility. I hope that all our listeners have found this webinar informative. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have any questions or feedback, we'd be more than happy to help you. Please contact us on the emails in the presentation. Thank you.